Have you ever wondered why Russia so often acts in ways that just seem to baffle the West? Well, today, we're going to try and crack that code. We're leaning on the analysis of a retired military intelligence colonel who argues that the key isn't in today's headlines, but in centuries of culture. Let's dive in.
You know, Winston Churchill really hit the nail on the head with this one back in 1939. For decades, Russia has often felt, well, impenetrable. Its motives can seem incredibly hard to grasp. It's this view of a complex nation that's just shrouded in layer after layer of history and intrigue.
But what if there's a key? What if there's a way to unlock this riddle? Our source today argues that there absolutely is. It's a concept that gets to the heart of why leaders from different countries can look at the exact same situation, a crisis, a threat, the use of force, and come to completely different conclusions.
And that key is a concept called strategic culture. Now, here's a fascinating twist. This theory wasn't developed in Russia. It was actually developed in the United States back in the 1970s. American strategists were trying to figure out how a superpower like the US could possibly lose a war in Vietnam. And they realized something crucial. Not every country runs on the same software. Culture, history, and shared beliefs really matter. And that's the lens we're going to be using today.
So to really get what's happening on the world stage today, we have to go deep. We're not just talking about recent events. We're talking about centuries of history that have forged a unique cultural bedrock.
See, the expert we're following here says you can't just think of one Russia. You have to see the multiple historical Russias that are all existing at the same time. First, you've got the influence from the Byzantine Empire, which brought this idea that the leader's power is divinely given. You just don't question it. Then came the brutal Mongol rule, which, for centuries, ingrained a system of personal autocracy and the idea that survival often required violence and corruption. And finally, the time of troubles, a period of absolute collapse, seared a core belief into the national psyche. Any strong leader, no matter how harsh, is better than chaos. These three layers are still profoundly shaping Russia's worldview. Okay, so how did all-av history create what you might call a cultural operating system? A unique software that, according to this analysis, still runs the country's decision-making today.
This brings us to a power structure that's been around for centuries, and it's absolutely crucial to understand. At the very top, you have the leader, the Tsar, or today, the president, who is seen as basically infallible, fundamentally righteous. In the middle, you have the boyars. Think of them as the officials, the governors, the entire bureaucracy. So when things go wrong, say the roads are a mess or pensions aren't paid, the blame never lands on the leader. Oh no, it's always the boyars who have failed to carry out his wise plans. It's a masterful system for shielding the person at the top from any real anger.
And this is where things get really fascinating. In the Russian language, there are two completely different words for truth. You have istina, which is the absolute, objective, capital T truth, the opposite of a lie. But then you have pravda, and pravda is different. It's a tactical truth. It's a truth that helps your group, your side, achieve its goals. And using pravda isn't necessarily seen as being dishonest. It's often seen as a practical, even necessary, way to navigate a tough world.
And you can see this idea of tactical truth, of pravda, in action, all over the place in modern geopolitics. When soldiers first showed up in Crimea, the official line was, "They are not Russian troops." It was a statement that served a purpose at that moment. After the MH17 tragedy, you saw a flood of competing theories designed to muddy the waters. With the Skripal poisoning or accusations of election interference, the response is just flat denial. Now, from a Western perspective that's focused on istina, this just looks like lying. But if you're operating with the logic of pravda, you're defending your team's interests at all costs.
So, okay, that's the internal logic. But how does all of this shape the way Russia sees the rest of the world? I mean, if your culture is built on these layers of invasion and chaos, how are you going to view your neighbors?
A huge piece of this puzzle is information. Think about this. According to our source, a whopping 80% of the Russian population gets its primary information from state-controlled television. That creates an environment where a single, powerful, and unified national story can be crafted and repeated over and over again.
And what's that story? It's the story of a besieged fortress. The narrative consistently paints Russia as being encircled by an aggressive NATO, constantly under attack from the West. This taps into a very deep, very real historical sense of insecurity, born from a geography of wide open plains with very few natural defenses. It unites people against a common enemy and reinforces that core idea, only a strong leader can protect us. This brings us to a really powerful quote from the legendary American diplomat George Kennan way back in 1946. According to this analysis, it is just as relevant today. The core idea is that, within this strategic culture, trying to persuade with logic and reason is often a dead end. What gets through, what is respected, is a clear demonstration of strength and power. Basically, the argument is that actions and force speak way louder than words.
So, what's underneath all of this? What's the one, single, deep-seated fear that drives this entire system? What is the absolute worst-case scenario that has to be avoided at all costs?
It all comes back to one thing, the historical time of troubles, or Sekasauron Aika. Now, this wasn't just a rough patch in history. We are talking about near-total state collapse. The central government dissolved, foreign armies occupied Moscow, the country basically ceased to exist. It's described as a kind of genetic memory of the ultimate national nightmare, a terrifying warning of what happens when the strong leader disappears.
And that deep historical trauma, it came roaring back to life in the 1990s. For many, many Russians, the post-Soviet period of democracy wasn't seen as freedom. It was seen as a new time of troubles. It was an era of economic collapse, national humiliation, and a feeling of total weakness on the world stage. And because of that, the very idea of democracy got tangled up with the idea of chaos, which powerfully reinforced that ancient belief. Only a strong, autocratic hand can save Russia from falling apart.
Okay, let's pull back for a second and just look at the big picture. When you look at the grand sweep of Russian history over hundreds of years, a very, very clear pattern starts to emerge.
If you map out the last 500-plus years, what you see is pretty stark. The historical norm, the default setting for Russia, has been autocratic, centralized rule. And when you see it laid out like this, that chaotic decade of democracy in the 1990s, well, it doesn't look like the beginning of a new chapter. It looks like a tiny, anomalous blip in a very long, very consistent history. In this view, the system today isn't some strange new thing, it's a return to the mean.
And that really brings us to the biggest question of all. Today, a new generation is growing up with access to the internet, with access to a whole world of information outside of state control. So will this deep-rooted strategic culture forged over all these centuries continue to hold? Or could a different future actually be possible? And that, well, that's the great unanswered question.